Well, good evening. My name is Evan Gregory, and this is Bible Answers. We're going to continue looking at the book of Galatians, and specifically, we're going to be looking at chapter 2 this evening. And in chapter 1, of course, Paul, being the writer here, he's writing to the churches of Galatia, and he begins chapter 1 by speaking of how crucial it is to have the pure gospel and to speak only the pure gospel. And in the latter part of chapter 1, he starts talking about his conversion and what he did shortly after his conversion. And in chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, we see where he continues that thought there. He says, "Then after 14 years I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, and also I took Titus with me, and I went up by revelation and communicated to them that gospel which I preach among the Gentiles, but privately to those who are of reputation, lest by any means I might run or had run in vain. Yet not even Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. And this occurred because of false brethren secretly brought in, who came in by stealth, despite our liberty which we have in Christ Jesus, that they might bring us into bondage, to whom we did not yield submission even for an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue with you." So he says, after 14 years, he went up to, and of course this was after his conversion, and this was afterward. It says in verse 21 of chapter 1 that he went to the regions of Syria and Cilicia. And notice there in that time he said he had not gone to Jerusalem, but then he says after 14 years he goes up to Jerusalem, and we see a problem here, that apparently there was somebody or some group of individuals that was compelling people to be circumcised. And of course this was a major part of the old Jewish law. This is part of this old covenant, that this was required of men to be circumcised. And so apparently there were some individuals there who were teaching that although they were Christians and although they were no longer bound by this law, that there was at least part of this law in which they were to keep. And so we see here that Titus, who was with Paul this time, he was not even compelled to be circumcised. Of course, Paul, being a Jew, this didn't, of course, he would have been circumcised, but he understood what was really going on. And we see here that those that brought it, notice how he describes these individuals, that he describes them as false brethren who brought in this teaching. And so these are people that they might have been Christians, but they're bringing this false teaching. They're bringing in this false doctrine. So he describes them as false brethren. He says that they are coming to spy out the liberty which they have in Christ Jesus, and says that they might bring us into bondage. So he's trying, and so Paul is saying, even though these people may be saying this is what you ought to do, Paul is saying the reality is these things are going to bring these individuals back into bondage. That they're going to lose that liberty which they have in Christ. And notice here that Paul did not just agree to disagree or just say, well, we'll just, we'll talk about this at a later time. He says he did not even yield submission to these individuals for an hour. So he's saying, we never submitted to them. We never agreed with this teaching. And the reason being says that the truth of the gospel might continue with them. And so, continuing on in chapter 2, he says, "But from those who seem to be something, whatever they were, it makes no difference to me. God shows personal favoritism to no man, for those who seem to be something add nothing to me. But on the contrary, when they saw that the gospel for the uncircumcised has been committed to me, as the gospel for the circumcised was to Peter, for he who worked effectively in Peter for the apostleship to the circumcised also worked effectively in me towards the Gentiles. And when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that had been given to me, they gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, that we should go to the Gentiles, and they to the circumcised, that they desired only that we should remember the poor, the very thing which I was also eager to do." And so here Paul makes the point that he says that really, regardless of who the people were, whether they were Jews, whether they were Gentiles, whether they were rich or poor, he says it made no difference to him. And he says God shows personal favoritism to no man. And so God shows no personal favoritism to anybody. It doesn't matter what they are. They're still going to be held accountable to the same law, to the same gospel. And here Paul has that same mindset. It doesn't matter who it is. That if somebody is well, at least in this context, speaking things that are not true, that are false, he's going to counter that, and he's going to spread that truth to whoever it is. He's not going to change what he says. He's not going to change the truth, regardless of who he is around. And he recalls again that here he says that the gospel to the uncircumcised was committed to him. So his focus was going to be for the Gentiles. That was going to be the main focus as far as spreading the gospel. But we see where these other apostles, James, Cephas, and John, or with Peter here specifically, that the Peter was focused on spreading the truth to the circumcised. And so they were all speaking the same gospel, but there were different focuses. There were specific areas in which these individuals were focused on spreading that truth. And Peter, James, and John, it says that they gave him what Paul describes as the right hand of fellowship. He's saying that they're giving him, I guess in a sense, their seal of approval. They realize who he is. They realize that he is an apostle just like they are, and that he's perfectly capable of spreading the truth, that he's receiving this truth by a revelation that he speaks of in chapter 1. And so he has the credentials to speak this message. He knows what he's talking about. He's not holding these things back, regardless of who it is. And we see later on in the next few verses where he actually lives that out and recalls the situation, even with Peter. In verse 11, he says, "Now when Peter had come to Antioch, I withstood him to his face, because he was to be blamed. For before certain men came from James, he would eat with the Gentiles. But when they came, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing those who were of the circumcision. And the rest of the Jews also played a hypocrite with them, so that even Barnabas was carried away with their hypocrisy." So, Paul, we see at the beginning of chapter 2, that these false brethren were teaching that these individuals had to be circumcised, in which they did not need to do so. And so there were problems here of these Judaizing teachers who were wanting these people to adopt at least parts of the old law. And we see here that there was a time in which even Peter did things that was contrary to the truth of the gospel. It says that certain men came from James. Assumingly these were Jews. And so he would eat with the Gentiles, but when these men from James came in, he separated himself from these Gentiles. And it says, fearing those who were of the circumcision. So it was fear of those individuals and fear of what they might say was the reason why he actually separated himself from the Gentiles. And it says, and the rest of the Jews also played the hypocrite with them, and even Barnabas was carried away with their hypocrisy. And so they were not being straightforward about this. And so they were keeping this part of the old law in which they were to separate themselves or be separated to some degree from the Gentiles, that they, making this kind of distinction that they were different from these individuals. And they were playing the hypocrite because of that. That the gospel, and of course we read later on in Galatians that because of the gospel, any of these lines that were drawn by race or ethnicity or whatever, those things are no more. And Peter here, he's being dishonest. He's playing the hypocrite because he's still trying to, I guess in a way, keep faith with the Jews, but he's doing that also because he feared those. feared those Jews. And verse 14 says, "But when I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter before them all, if you, being a Jew, live in the manner of Gentiles and not as the Jews, why do you compel Gentiles to live as Jews, we who are Jews by nature, and not sinners of the Gentiles, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ? Even we have believed in Christ Jesus, that we might be justified by faith in Christ, and not by the works of the law. For by the works of the law no flesh shall be justified." And so notice how Paul handles this. He does not pull or seemingly pull Peter off to the side. He does not do this in a very private manner. It says that he says to Peter before them all. So he's doing this in at least a fairly public setting, and he's calling Peter out, and he's saying basically that you live as a Jew. You're a Jew and you're living as a Gentile, but then you're turning around and you're trying to compel these Gentiles to live as Jews. And so he's being a hypocrite. He's not even living as a Jew, and yet because of what he's doing, he's compelling these Gentiles to live as Jews. And so this was not a problem of Peter actually saying, hey, this is what you ought to do. It was because of his actions that was compelling people to do things or to believe things that were not true, that were false teachings. And so it's important for us to realize that it's not just the words that we say that matters, it's also the things that we do. What we do can have a major impact on the things that people believe and what they do. And if they see us, and especially somebody like Peter, being a pillar of the truth, as Paul puts it, that because of the Gentiles seeing this, they could be easily persuaded and say, well, we ought to be doing these things because Peter is. And recognized, and also it's another point that, Peter could be swayed. And so if Peter, and then we see Paul himself actually says that there was a possibility that he could be swayed from the truth as well. And so there's still that accountability here, even for the apostles, and recognition that that even though they were guided by the Spirit, that they knew the truth, that they themselves could become misguided as well. But we see here Paul correcting Peter, and he's saying, you ought not to be doing this, that these individuals are not justified by the works of law. Notice what he says in verse 16, the man is not justified by the works of law. These things, the circumcision, this doesn't do anything. This has no power to save, but he says you're justified by faith in Christ. And so he says that we might be justified by faith in Christ and not by the works of the law, for by the works of the law no flesh shall be justified. So this does you no good to keep that. And to keep that, and what we understand in chapter 1, that if we believe that we have to keep parts of the law in order to be saved or to be justified, we're teaching a false doctrine. And so we're condemned because we're teaching those false things. Verse 17 says, but if we, while we seek to be justified by Christ, we ourselves also are found sinners, is Christ therefore a minister of sin? Certainly not, for if I build again those things which I destroyed, I make myself a transgressor. For I through the law died to the law, that I might live to God. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. In the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Do not set aside the grace of God, for righteousness comes through the law. Then Christ died in vain. Notice what he says. He says, for I through the law died to the law, that I might live to God. So these things, or this law, has been done away with. Through Christ, this new covenant has been established. And so I've died to these things. I have been crucified with Christ. Verse 20, he says, it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God. This law no longer has any, we're no longer living by this old law. That everything I do, I'm doing these things strictly by faith in Christ, and that is how we're going to be justified. That's how we're going to be saved. And if we build those things again, like he says in verse 18, if we build up those things again, if we go back and try to be justified by the old law, or try to be justified by any other thing, or go back to our old way of doing things, we make ourselves a transgressor. We're going back, and as Peter puts it in 2 Peter, we're becoming worse than if we have not even known the truth at all. And so he's making himself a transgressor if he's going to go back and hold to those things, the law again. But again, the focus here is how we're justified. We're justified by faith in Christ, and not by any of these works of the law. Verse 21 says, I do not set aside the grace of God, for righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died in vain. That's pretty plainly put there. That if righteousness comes through the law, that Christ died in vain, there's no reason for him to come. And we understand, and very vividly, especially in the book of Romans, that we can't be justified by the law because no one can keep it. And so we have, the only way that we could be made righteous is through Christ and through his sacrifice. And so really you get into a conundrum there. If you're going to be, circumcised or keep parts of the old law, and you try to do this and you try to be justified by it, but the problem is you can't keep it. And so therein lies the problem, that you can't be saved by it because you can't keep it. So there's got to be something else. And of course we have that something else through Christ, and through faith in Christ we can be justified, we can be saved. And so and we really see the dangers there of bringing in other teachings, and the danger of mixing in things which were at one time true, that being the old law, mixing in those things with this new covenant and this gospel that we have through Christ. And by mixing those things in, you pervert the gospel. And so we have to strive to keep the gospel pure always. So I hope that's been useful for all of you. Again, I'm a member of North Columbus Church of Christ. You can find out more about us at northcolumbuschristians.com. You find our contact information. And if you have a comment or question, I failed to mention this before, but if you have a comment or question, please leave that. I'll love to see those things, and I'll respond to that accordingly. But again, next week we're going to be in Galatians chapter 3. And I hope that this has been useful, and we're going to try to do this about every Sunday evening, and so keep an eye out for that. But until then, thanks.